Let's take a deeper dive now into relations between the U.S. and China. We're joined by Sourabh Gupta with the Institute for China-America Studies, where he's a senior Asia-Pacific relations specialist. Welcome back to the show, Sourabh.
Thank you.
So a bill is making its way through the U.S. Congress right now, intended to counter China's influence. What are your thoughts on the motivation of this?
You know, there are actually quite a lot of bills right now winding their way through Congress. Let's look at it from this perspective. Military competition has a tendency to being zero sum, but economic competition is actually positive sum. So it's fine if there are bills which are there to enhance the economic competitiveness of the US as long as it's on a level playing field. That is good competition. So there's not an issue with those bills per se. To the extent that bills kind of end up antagonistic and brand China as a threat, those bills obviously don't help the relationship, and I hope they will be written with careful wording and with circumspection.
So do you fear some of the consequences of these, antagonizing bills should they become law?
I mean, a lot of countries are trying to figure out ways how to cope with China. The US is no different. Of course, the US is the incumbent great power. It sees China as the emerging great power. There is this element of great power competition, even though the Chinese side has tried to reframe the debate as a major power engage situation so that there's greater scope for engagement. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that the US, and particularly the sentiment against China on the Hill, these bills, some of them unfortunately will come through. But again, the point out here is that the differences, let's try to have those minimized, and let's try to accentuate the areas where the two sides can cooperate. And even if they have to compete to cooperate, as long as it's done on a fair level playing field.
And speaking of those areas of cooperation, there was much talk about China's participation in this week's climate summit hosted by President Biden. Would you say that climate change is perhaps the most promising area for cooperation?
Oh, yes, it absolutely is. You know, this was a summit called by President Biden. There was no necessity for President Xi to come up and make those important statements with regard to picking date for even for coal. Mr. President Xi could have come right down there in November at Glasgow at COP26 and made a dramatic statement out there. But China is not playing to its grievances. It's playing to the interests. It's playing to its common interests with the US. And obviously, climate change is a huge area because it's the overarching threat facing all of us. But I would not limit it only to climate change. I would say global public health is an immense area of cooperation in terms of resourcing poor and developing countries which are facing significant burdens, economic burdens, and debt challenges. That is an area also of cooperation. So I think the US China relationship can do much for the world, and even where they compete economically, they can do it on level playing field terms, which will be for the benefit of both sides and for Asia and the world.
So, I'm curious, where do you see bilateral ties going under President Biden? He's now approaching that benchmark 100 days in office. We've sort of seen the way, some of his policies, how he's governing. Where do you see ties with China?
You know, the narrative is still harsh. It's still continuing, much of that narrative still continuing with the Trump administration's narrative with regard to China and the unfortunate sentiments that the Trump administration brought to the fore. But I will say that in terms of actual day-to-day cooperation, that sphere of cooperation is being expanded incrementally, very judiciously, and I feel that sphere will just keep growing even in the economic area where President Biden, who is reviewing many of the harsh economic decisions against China over the past 2 years, is going to pull some of them back. So the space for cooperation is expanding. And I would tend to think that while Mr. Biden talked about competing and cooperating, we will see that there are much greater dividends paid from cooperation than from competition. And that's where I expect the relationship to gradually go.
Sourabh Gupta, always good to have your thoughts. Thank you.